Welcome. You are about to view a recorded talk from the online seminar series, Progress and Visions in the Scientific Study of the Mind-Matter Relation, held in 2018. The seminars aim to bring together researchers from around the globe with a background in mathematics or physics who are interested in the scientific study of consciousness and the mind-matter relation. While each seminar session consists of a talk and a discussion, the latter is not recorded, and the following video will only contain the talk. We hope you enjoy it. For further information, please visit mind-matter-relation.org.
Good. So, as you've seen from my first slide, I will talk about consciousness and autonomy within the causal framework of integrated information theory. And the starting point for our work is that we view the brain as an evolved system of mechanisms, and which means like you're an agent, you can interact with the world, you have certain perceptions, and you can react to based on those. So you see a tiger and you run away, and those perceptions come with a conscious experience. And we also know, though, that you can have basically the exact same conscious experience when this sensory input is, so for example, when you're dreaming. And that means that your conscious perceptions are intrinsic, they come from within the brain and are not necessarily due to what's out there in the world. And that raises the question how consciousness is related to the things out in the world. And to avoid some common misunderstandings, I want to say that when I talk about consciousness, I always mean plain experience. So consciousness, the word, is also used for more specific features, for example, an awareness of the environment, or a self-awareness or reflective awareness, meaning that you know that you're conscious and you're reflecting upon that. That's nothing, that's not what I'm talking about. All I'm talking about is you see something, you have, it feels like something to be you, the quality of your percepts and thoughts, and just basically your inner movie in your head, right? And it's not associated with any kind of function a priori. And so at least within the framework of IIT, there can be a dissociation between intelligence and consciousness. So you can have very intelligent machines, for example, that according to integrated information theory do not have the right causal structure to be conscious. And you can have systems that do have the right causal structure but don't interact with the world at all, and therefore do not show any kind of intelligent behavior. But typically the way that we intuitively judge consciousness, we do associate it strongly with intelligence, and mostly because the only other beings that we grant consciousness to without thinking twice are other human beings, and we think of ourselves as being quite intelligent. And then most people would also consider animals that are very similar to us to be conscious, but maybe less so. And then the degree to which we would intuitively subscribe consciousness to other beings does depend on what they're able to do and how similar they are to us. But in principle, you cannot really judge whether somebody, even another human being, is conscious based on their input-output function, right? So that has been a problem in the clinic. For example, you get a patient, they're unresponsive, and the question is, are they conscious or are they not? And a lot of the obvious measures have not proven to be relevant and reliable markers of consciousness. So for example, it's not true that the number of neurons involved in the brain would be an indicator. Even within our brain, the cerebellum has many more neurons than the cerebral cortex, and you can take out the entire cerebellum and you will not change much in the experience of, in the phenomenal experience of people. It's also not the overall levels of brain activity, and not the metabolic rates, and not certain states where neurons are highly synchronized, because in all of these there is states that also show the same features and are associated with unconsciousness. So over the past 30 years, most research on consciousness from the neurosciences has focused on neural correlates of consciousness, which means that you correlate whenever somebody, the state of consciousness, so being conscious or unconscious, with certain features of the brain when you're conscious or unconscious, or also certain conscious contents, and you try to see whatever has to happen in the brain whenever you're conscious of a specific content. And the goal is to go from these correlations to certain generalized principles to learn something about the nature of consciousness. And here's where integrated information theory differs, because in IIT starts from phenomenology itself without looking at the physical substrate first. So from within phenomenology, IIT tries to understand what consciousness is by identifying its essential properties. So we try to find a list of all the features that are true for every experience. And only once we understand what consciousness is within phenomenology itself, then we want to translate that into postulates that are required properties of the physical substrate that a physical system must fulfill, that are necessary and sufficient to produce an experience. And let's see here. Right. These are, one second. These are the contenders for the moment for being essential properties of phenomenal existence, and hopefully a sufficient set. And to quickly go over them, so the first is that every experience is intrinsic. So just consciousness exists, but it exists for the experiencing subject. It's not accessible in a third person way. You cannot feel what I'm feeling. You cannot be conscious of what I'm conscious of, but each one of us has an experience that is immediately available to them, and that can be assessed even empirically from a first-person perspective. Then consciousness is, every experience is always composed of many different things that are related in certain ways. So for example, here in this picture, you see like the legs of the person from their own perspective. Red book, a blue book, you might see the red book and the yellow wall, but no yellow book, right? So there are certain relations and bindings, but not others. So there's structure in the experience. And that structure is very informative because every experience distinguishes itself from every other experience you could possibly have by its content. And then the fourth one is integration, and that just means that you always have one experience. So it's always one, whatever parts of your experience that you can single out, they're still embedded in this one unitary experience that you have at every point in time that you're conscious, and it cannot be split. And the exclusion property says that your experience is definite. So there are things that are inside your experience and there are things that are outside of your experience. So I'm not experiencing what you're experiencing. There is a border of all the content. So there's definite content. That definite content may include that you're not certain about something, but it's still things are either in or out, right? And the same is true for the spatio-temporal scale of consciousness. Your conscious experience runs at a certain speed, and it doesn't go faster or slower at any given moment. That doesn't mean that you cannot have the perception that your time goes slower or faster, as we were talking about before, but at every moment in time, your experience includes a certain extension in space and time. Right? And So these properties we want to translate into properties for the physical system, and the corresponding principle is the principle of existence. So consciousness exists as a phenomenal experience, and this phenomenal existence is translated into properties of physical existence, which we take to be cause-effect power. So to exist in a physical sense, in physical terms, you must be able to make a difference to something, and something must be able to make a difference to you. And that's where causation comes in. So the 5 principles that we identified that are properties of every possible experience, now we want to translate them in necessary and sufficient properties of the cause-effect power that the system has onto itself. And that is captured by the cause-effect structure of the system. And then, according to IIT, the experience is a maximum of integrated information, which is the same as the intrinsic cause-effect power of the system. And so IIT provides the means to quantify the level of consciousness, which is the integrated information of the system. And it also describes the quality of the experience, which is the cause-effect structure. So what we want to go for is that we can take a system and we can analyze all the ways in which the elements constrain each other in a causal sense. And that will be the cause-effect structure. And every phenomenal distinction in your experience will have a corresponding distinction in this cause-effect structure. So there will be a one-to-one correspondence between the content of your experience and the structure of the cause-effect structure. Just to give you a quick sense of what this cause-effect structure is in the formal framework of IIT, I'll show you this very small system. And first we take our candidate system, so a subset of the system for which we want to unfold the intrinsic cause-effect structure. And when we do this, we keep all the elements around that system fixed as background conditions. They're conditioned on their current state and are not further considered. What is analyzed is how every element in the system constrains the past and future states of the system, and we take its constraints over those elements that are maximal constrained by that element. So for A, for example, it constrains the past of B and C because A is an AND gate. It is off, and that means that B and C must have been in any of the 3 states where B and C are not both on, right? Because otherwise the AND gate would have been on. And that is the causal information that the AND gate in its current state has about the past of the system. Then it also has information about the future of the system, because the AND gate is off at the moment. The OR gate is likely to be, it's also going to be off because it's basically a copy gate of the AND gate in the system with D being fixed. While we analyze the cause-effect power that A has within the system, we keep all the other elements as undetermined. So their state is not taken into account, their state is marginalized. We do that for all the elements within the system and get how they constrain the past and the future of the remaining elements. But we also do so for all combinations of elements. And there we have, for example, a second order mechanism where the B and C in the system together constrain something about the past of A and B, and they constrain something about the future of A. But important here is that what they do together is more than what they would do here by themselves. And so if we have a higher order mechanism in the system, it must be irreducible to the parts, and that is measured by the integrated information of the mechanism. And in this system, there's only one higher order mechanism. All the other ones are reducible. So you can partition them in some way without losing any of their constraints that they have about the past and the future. And so this information that is specified, this causal information that is specified by all the elements and their combination in the system, is jointly the cause-effect structure of the system. And the cause-effect structure can be represented as these points or stars in a cause-effect space that is spanned by the possible states of the system. So every mechanism within the system can be represented by a star, where its location describes the probability distribution, and its size is its irreducibility. Right, and that is what you see here. So for a system such as the brain, that structure will be amazingly gigantic and rich, with myriads of constraints and relations that then correspond to the experience of the system according to IIT. And so there's a postulated identity. So because every item in the experience should have a corresponding distinction in the cause-effect structure, that cause-effect structure is identical to the experience. But it's important to understand that we don't say that the physical substrate itself is identical to the experience. It's unfolded cause-effect structure. So that much for IIT. One last note on the way that on the notion of information in integrated information theory. So information is typically viewed from an extrinsic perspective. Shannon information is about a correlation between some input and some output that is sent over a channel. And that is not the way that information is taken in integrated information theory. Instead, the notion of information is intrinsic. It's about the differences that make a difference, the causes and effects from the intrinsic perspective of the system. So how all these elements constrain each other, and the input and output doesn't really matter. It's fixed to whatever it is. So it still can influence the state of the system, but it will not be part of the cause-effect structure. So summary of integrated information theory. What distinguishes it is that it starts from phenomenology and not from behavioral or neurocorrelates. It identifies the essential properties of every experience, and it aims to derive the requirements that a physical system must satisfy in order to account for them. It has explanatory, predictive, and inferential power. So once you have that, the possibility to measure both the quantity and the quality of consciousness, you can make predictions that can be tested on humans that are able to report on their experience, and you can see if the predictions you made are correct, right? And it also has inferential power in that once it's verified, or once it holds up sufficiently well in those predictions, it's the best possible starting point. So a good theory in that sense is the best starting point to make inferences for systems that we cannot know in any other way what their experiences are. So you cannot ask your iPhone if it's conscious or not, or I mean, you can definitely ask it. You cannot trust the answer, right? Because last time I checked, my iPhone said, I'm conscious if you are, which is pretty creepy. So to make inferences about these systems, you better have a theory, and intuition is not a good guide, as humans tend to grant consciousness to anything that is sufficiently able to reproduce our behavior, and at some point that might become dangerous. So also integrated information theory proposes a formal framework to characterize the intrinsic cause-effect structure of discrete dynamical systems. And that can be used to answer certain questions that arise. For example, here, what we left with, what is the connection between consciousness and the environment if, as IIT says, in principle, there could be a disconnect between intelligence and consciousness. And we have studied that on these small systems that are small neural networks with sensors, some hidden elements, and some motors. They're simulated, and we start them out without any connections, and then they're evolved to perform a task in an environment. So for example, here, in most of the tasks I will show you, the animats have to catch blocks of different sizes. So for example, they have to catch blocks of size 1, but they have to avoid blocks of size 3, which is just a simple categorization task. And so we start them out without connections. We measure their fitness. At the beginning, it will be very low. And then based on an algorithm of mutations, deletions, and duplications in their genome, they will start to have more complex networks and eventually might be able to do the task with quite high fitness, right? So try to simulate evolution in a relatively biological way. Oh, this is just a picture of, so each of these animates is equipped with a genome that has integers and that codes how their neurons are connected with each other, and it also codes for the functions of the elements. Studying those agents, letting them evolve, and in this case, it was a task where they had to find the quickest route through this maze. We found that there is a correlation between the fitness and the integrated information that these animals evolved. So they, just to be clear, they are evolved in order to solve the task. So nothing in the evolution says that they must evolve integrated information. But with increasing fitness, the networks that they evolved had higher integrated information. And first study back in 2014 also showed that this increase of integrated information is task dependent, which means that in easy tasks, the agents still evolved integrated information over time on average, but less so than in a more difficult tasks that required more memory and more integration of time steps. So in the red task, which is the red task shows the best agents of the more difficult task, and you can see that they evolved many more much more integrated information and more intrinsic mechanisms than in the simple task. Right. In the simple task, though, this shows the dissociation between intelligence and consciousness that is possible. So in the simple task that can be solved based on pure sensory inputs, we did have animates that solved the task perfectly without any integrated information, but also agents that did evolve integrated networks and also solved the task perfectly. So they're both equally intelligent. One would be conscious in principle and one would not be, and that's a possibility. But as I said, for more difficult tasks that require memory and integration over multiple time steps, multiple sensory inputs, the fitter agents did all show integrated information. I skipped the video to be faster and not introduce any technical problems, but what you could see here in that video with just the green and the black bars, the green bar, the animate, would have followed the black bar for a while, but then turned around and caught it on the other side. So it means that its behavior is not directly dependent on the momentary sensory input, but it also takes its internal states into account. And that is different from, for example, a feed-forward system or a very modular system that can show quite complex behavior, like, for example, your digital camera is able to show you every picture that you take with it, which is quite complex behavior. But it does so in a very modular and non-integrated way. And so whatever it shows you is, by definition, entirely driven by the environment. So that is how having integrated information is connected to being autonomous, in the sense that you're not just reacting to whatever is presented to you right now, but you can also take your own states into account in your actions. And this is shown by a neat side experiment that we did on those agents. That is, for some of them that were evolved to the, or we let them evolve again to the simple task where you didn't really need much integrated information to solve it, but with one less sensor. So now they only had one sensor, and now they had to solve the task entirely based on memory by counting how large the blocks are. And because their sensory capacities were lower, they had to compensate by higher internal complexity, and thus evolved higher integrated information there. So they were all able to solve, some of them were able to solve the task really well, and those evolved integrated information. So why did consciousness evolve within the framework of IIT? As I said, a priori, IIT does not associate consciousness with any specific function, but there is practical reasons for why adaptive systems, the evolution to an environment with a rich causal structure, comes with higher intrinsic cause-effect power, meaning higher phi. And that is because there's potential advantages of integrated over modular systems. So first, integrated systems are more economical. You need less units to implement more functions, because those higher order mechanisms actually are useful and can be used for internal processing. Integration also allows for higher degeneracy in function and architecture, which means that the system more flexibly can respond to changes in the environment. And there's like small differences so it's more robust in the sense that small differences to the system do not affect its function in the same way as a feed-forward system would be affected. And then that means that they're also better substrate for selection. One problem is that they're hard to understand for scientists wanting to study them. And I can tell you that even those animats with 4 hidden elements, it's very hard to understand what kind of algorithm they actually use to solve the task, right? And but the integrated system has an intrinsic understanding of the situation, and that it can be sensitive to the context and show different behavior, even given or the same behavior given different environments. So this is a summary. So IIT starts from these axioms, the properties of phenomena existence. Those are translated into necessary and sufficient requirements for the physical existence, for being a system that then is able to have experiences. And the question why consciousness evolved then becomes the question why integrated information evolved, as you can see here. So by going through those axioms, you can answer the question, even though IIT in principle is not saying that there is a specific function associated with consciousness. We also applied this idea that, so the connection between integrated information and robustness and autonomy, we also studied based on a small Boolean network that simulates the fish and yeast cell cycle. So if you have the system, each node represents some kind of protein that is interacting when the cell is splitting. And studying that network, we found that in every state in the natural evolution, the biological transition, that this network was an integrated system and thus had borders, causal borders, that each of those nodes said something about the past and the future of the system. And so it exists in a causal sense as a different autonomous system from the environment. But you can construct a functionally identical network that goes through the exact same biological evolution, exact same state transitions that simulate the biological evolution. And that system does not form a system that has integrated information that is stable. And so in this way, IIT, so this analysis allowed us to compare which kind of mechanisms within the system are there for just performing the function, and which are there for giving robustness to that system, which is the difference between the full cell cycle model and the functionally identical one. And it shows again that you can have two systems that perform the same function, but they're still different in how they exist and whether they exist as a system for themselves, which means that they have causal constraints on the system itself from within the system, which this one has, but this one doesn't. As a final overview of what we're currently working on, I want to tell you a bit about autonomous actions and actual causation from the perspective of integrated information theory. So once you have such an agent with the sensors and the motors, and let's say that it does form, it has this integrated core, so it has a set of elements that forms an integrated system with some integrated information. You can distinguish reflexes from autonomous actions by identifying whether the actual cause for the action, the same action in both cases, can be found outside of the system. So if it just was like reacting to sensory input directly, or whether the actual cause comes from within the system, whether the internal state of the agent was the cause for the action. So you can distinguish extrinsic causes for an action and intrinsic causes for an action. And this is based, so how do you identify what caused the action? And that is called actual causation. It's the crucial question is what caused what, given that given that you know the state transitions of a system. So here we have such a system with an input and an output. It forms an integrated complex, and we do know that given some input and its internal state at t-1, it then transitioned into that state. Even though we know all this, we can still ask, or we still have to ask, what was the actual cause of for example, element A turning on at time t. And note that within physics, all you ever get as an answer is that everything in the path light cone of the event or something was a cause. But maybe, maybe the input didn't contribute anything to the state of A being on at t. So So if we want to find out mechanistically what really could be a cause, we still have to ask this question and analyze the causal structure of the system. And we can do so applying the exact same principles that are at the heart of IAT to get an answer to the what caused what question. Just very briefly, so let's say you have the element A here, and it now is in state 1, and we know that it had 3 inputs at time t minus 1, the input from outside of the system and 2 elements inputting from within the system. We can test for all of them and all their combinations how likely their particular state was given that A is on at the present time, which is this probability, the upper probability distribution, and compare that against not knowing what the state is, and take a ratio of those probabilities, and for the input that ratio is negative, or then cut off to be 0. So it means that the input did not contribute to producing the state of A being on in that particular transition. In a different transition, it could have, right? Because A is an OR gate, and if the input would have been on, then maybe it could have been a cause, but it wasn't in this particular transition. And then we can do so for all possible combinations of these inputs. And in this case, we find that for C, the probability that C was on is higher, knowing that A was on, than if you do not know then A was on. And that's actually the highest value you can get in this particular transition. And that makes C the actual cause of A. And of course, this is a pretty trivial example. If I just show you this, you could have told me probably that clearly this is an OR gate and C was on. But there's much more complex transitions where identifying the actual cause can be quite tricky. And just the very last thing I have to say before summarizing is that so often autonomy is somehow connected to intrinsic noise in the system. So the only way to cause something or from within the system that is not caused by the environment, the answer to that is often taken to be noise. So maybe I have some intrinsic noise source, and that makes me do something that couldn't be predicted, something like that. But in the framework of IIT, adding noise to the system will only decrease the strength with which the elements constrain each other, and thereby decrease its autonomy. And the same for actions that are caused from within the system. If I add noise to like an actual cause, so here you just have a copy, and in a deterministic sense, it would be caused with 1 bit of information. If I add noise, that causal strength only goes down. So the notion of autonomy within IIT is perfectly compatible with a deterministic system. It just means that your action, so being means that you are a system that whose elements constrain each other on top of inputs from the environment, and acting in an autonomous way means that as such a system, your intrinsic states can be the actual causes of your action in certain cases. Okay. No, I do have one more thing to say about computers. You might have wondered before when I talked about this slide that so IIT does say that computers do not have the right causal structure to be conscious because they are very modular, and there is actually no. So we have a paper coming out that will show that even if you try to black box the transistors and physical elements of a computer, you cannot find the causal structure of the system that it's simulating inside the computer. So there's no way that the computer could even if it's simulating your brain activity or your behavior, the cause-effect structure of the computer will not be any similar to the cause-effect structure of the brain. which means, again, that, oh yeah, so here is an example of a very little system and a sort of computer that is implementing that exact same system, and that system has a very small value of integrated information, but the computer does not, even though it is perfectly functionally equivalent to that system. You can scale that up to a computer that is universal and could, in principle, simulate our behavior perfectly to the extent that it's computable, and it could also simulate our neural organization perfectly, and it still would not be conscious in any way that is remotely similar to how we are conscious. That does not mean that IIT says that you could not possibly have an artificial system that is conscious, but it has to be built with the right causal structure. And just a last remark, we have an entropy special issue coming up, and if you would contribute, that would be excellent. And that's it from my side.